Ever get the feeling that the economy is kind of like a game that's rigged? Like, even when you think you're doing everything right, you still end up struggling.
Well, it's not just a feeling. There are systems in place designed to keep some people struggling, and today we're going to explore one that really impacts autistic individuals, the Reserve Army of Labor.
Reserve Army of Labor, that sounds kind of ominous. What exactly are we talking about here?
Think of it like a giant pool of workers. They're kept in this state of uncertainty and desperation. It's a key feature of capitalism that Karl Marx talked about. Basically, having way more workers than jobs keeps wages low and keeps people from, demanding better treatment.
So it's not just about how many people are unemployed, it's about creating this imbalance of power.
Exactly. And that leads us right into today's deep dive. We're looking at an article by Dr. Jaime Hoerricks called The Reserve Army of Labor, Autistic Exclusion and the Illusion of Full Employment. It shines a light on just how this system impacts autistic individuals.
I gotta say, some of what Horrocks talks about is pretty unsettling. Like, they talk about how even those initiatives for inclusion can be a trap and how the unemployment numbers we see don't tell the whole story.
That's right. So to break it down, Horrocks describes three categories within this reserve army. First, there's the floating reserve. It's made up of folks constantly cycling through those low-wage, unstable jobs. A lot of self-diagnosed or level 1 autistic people often find themselves stuck there.
So they're always treading water, never really finding solid ground.
Right. And then you have the latent reserve. These are people who are basically shut out, because of disability or discrimination. A lot of level 2 autistic people end up here facing all these barriers to entering the workforce.
So the system kind of just like categorizes and marginalizes people based on how it sees them rather than what they can actually do.
Yeah, pretty much. And then there's the most marginalized group, the stagnant reserve. These are folks who are chronically unemployed, often facing institutionalization. Autistic people with level 3 diagnoses are way overrepresented in this group. The system basically just writes them off completely.
It's heartbreaking to think that so many people are left behind because they don't fit this narrow definition of a productive worker. But let's go back to that idea that inclusion efforts can be a trap. I think a lot of people, especially those who champion these initiatives, struggle to grasp that.
It's definitely a complex issue. But Horrocks argues that we need to be critical of how capitalism uses inclusion.
Hmm.
Historically, marginalized groups have been welcomed into the workforce just as their type of labor is about to become obsolete. Look at manufacturing jobs, for example.
Okay, I see where you're going with this.
Mm.
As automation started replacing those jobs, there was this big push for disabled workers to enter those roles. It was presented as progress, but
But really, these workers were being funneled into jobs that were about to disappear. It wasn't about creating real opportunities. It was about getting that last bit of profit before machines took over. We saw this with clerical work and the rise of computers, and now Horrocks suggests we're seeing it with programming and AI.
wait, so all those neurodiversity hiring initiatives we're seeing in the tech industry, those could actually be setting autistic people up to fail as AI takes over coding jobs.
That's the concern that Horrocks raises, yeah. It's this cynical cycle where capitalism embraces you just long enough to exploit your labor and then discards you when you're no longer profitable.
It's incredibly disheartening. Like you're working hard, thinking you're finally getting a fair shot, only to find out you're being used to prop up a system that ultimately doesn't care about you.
And it starts early, too. Horrocks argues that the education system plays a big role in setting autistic people up for this kind of failure. Well, the rigid environment of traditional education, it often isn't very accommodating. That can set autistic students up for repeated setbacks. They start to internalize the message that no matter how hard they try, they'll never be good enough. It leads to what psychologists call learned helplessness.
Learned helplessness, that feeling of powerlessness, even when you could change things, because you've been conditioned to believe you can't. And then this feeling just follows them into the workforce.
Exactly. Every job rejection, every inaccessible workplace, it just reinforces that feeling. It's a vicious cycle.
So you've got this reserve army, this whole system designed to keep workers in line, and you've got the education system seemingly priming certain people to become part of it. But Horrocks also talks about how the way we measure unemployment is part of the problem, right?
Right, and this is where it gets even more concerning. The unemployment numbers we usually see, the U3 numbers, don't tell the whole story.
Hold on, are you saying those numbers are misleading?
I wouldn't say they're outright lies, but they only give you a very limited view. The U3 only counts people who've actively looked for work in the past 4 weeks. So if you've given up looking or you're underemployed and want full-time work, you're not even included.
So They're manipulating the numbers to make unemployment seem less severe than it really is.
Yeah. There are other measures, like U6, which includes some of those discouraged and underemployed workers. But even that doesn't give you the full picture. There's also something called shadow stats, which uses the same methodology over time and hasn't been affected by changing definitions. It paints a much bleaker picture of reality.
So how does this manipulation of unemployment figures, how does that specifically impact autistic individuals?
Well, think about those who faced years of rejection and have just stopped looking for work. They're not included in the U3 numbers, so their struggles are basically invisible. Also, a lot of autistic people turn to gig work out of necessity, but they're often misclassified and not represented accurately in the data.
It's like the system is designed to erase their struggles, to make it seem like the problem isn't as big as it actually is. No wonder so many people feel like the deck is stacked against them. But where do AI and automation fit into all of this?
That's what we'll be exploring next. Hoerricks argues that these technologies aren't just taking jobs away, they're reshaping work itself in a way that gives more power to capital and leaves even fewer options for those who are already marginalized.
So last time we were talking about how the system creates this reserve army of labor and how autistic individuals are particularly vulnerable to its manipulations.
Right, and Hoerricks takes it even further, arguing that it's not just about controlling labor, it's about controlling information too, like what we even have access to.
Okay, so on top of everything else, they're trying to keep us in the dark about how this whole thing works. What does that even look like in practice?
Well, think about how we get information these days. We've got these massive media corporations shaping the narrative, often downplaying or completely ignoring the struggles of people who don't fit the mold.
And then there are those algorithms online, filtering what we see and who we connect with.
Exactly. It's not just outright censorship. It's more insidious than that.
Mm.
It's like they're subtly controlling the flow of information to benefit those in power.
So they're shaping what we think, what we believe, and ultimately stopping us from challenging the way things are.
Yeah. And when it comes to the economic system, this control becomes even more powerful.
Hoerricks even mentions that just sharing critical analysis online, like their own article, is getting harder and harder.
Right. It's like you're shouting into a void. Hoerricks talks about how these algorithms can suppress dissenting voices through things like shadow banning and limiting reach. Even if you have a platform, even if you have something important to say, the system is working against you to make sure your message doesn't get out there.
So even if you manage to break free from that cycle of, precarious work, you're still facing an uphill battle just to be heard.
It's a multi-layered system of control, It creates these digital echo chambers where only certain perspectives get amplified, usually the ones that maintain the status quo.
Like you said, it's like you're shouting into a void. And for people who are trying to raise awareness about these issues, it must feel incredibly isolating.
Absolutely. It fosters this feeling of hopelessness. You start to believe that your voice doesn't matter, that you can't possibly challenge a system this big.
So what can we do? If they're actively trying to suppress this kind of knowledge, how can we break through?
Well, first we need to recognize that it's happening. Once you see how information is being controlled, you can start to critically evaluate what you're reading and watching. You can actively seek out alternative sources, connect with groups challenging the system, and most importantly, share what you learn with others.
So it's about being proactive, being skeptical of what we're told, and consciously seeking out the truth, even when it's being hidden.
Exactly. It's an act of defiance. Every time you share an article like Hoerricks, every time you talk to someone about these issues, you're chipping away at that wall of control.
It's like planting seeds of awareness, helping people see the cracks in the system. It sounds like it takes a collective effort to push back against this information control.
It absolutely does. It's about building networks, supporting independent media, and amplifying the voices that are being silenced. It's about reclaiming our right to knowledge and using it to fight for a more just world.
This has been incredibly eye-opening, but before we move on, what do you think is the most important takeaway for our listener so far? What's the one thing you really hope they walk away with from this conversation?
I think the most crucial point is that we have to reject this idea that our worth is tied to our productivity. We need to reclaim our inherent dignity and demand a system that supports that dignity, not one that just measures us by how much we produce.
That's powerful. It's about rejecting the system's narrow definition of value and recognizing the inherent worth of every individual, regardless of whether they can meet those expectations.
Exactly, and Hoerricks doesn't just diagnose the problem, they offer solutions too.
So what does a more equitable future actually look like? What are some of the alternatives to this exploitative system that we've been talking about?
One solution they explore is worker-owned cooperatives. This is where individuals, including those who are neurodivergent, can have more control over their work. They can build businesses that actually meet their needs. It shifts the power dynamic, allows people to work together in a more collaborative and supportive environment.
So instead of trying to fit into a system that wasn't built for them, they can create systems that work.
Right. It's about empowering individuals to take control of their livelihoods and create a more sustainable and just economic model.
That's a refreshing perspective, but are worker-owned cooperatives really a realistic option, especially for folks who've been pushed to the margins for so long?
That's where the other solution Hoerricks discusses comes in, and that's universal basic income, or UBI. It's the idea that everyone gets a basic level of economic security, no matter their employment status.
So it's about creating a safety net for everyone, making sure that even those who can't participate in the traditional workforce can still live with dignity and have their basic needs met.
Exactly. It would free people up to pursue their passions, develop their skills, and contribute to society in ways that might not fit into that traditional economic mold. It's about recognizing that everyone has something to offer and making sure they have what they need to thrive.
It's a radical shift from this system where your worth is tied to your ability to generate profit. It's about recognizing the inherent value of every person, regardless of their economic output.
Exactly. And it's a shift that could be really transformative for those who've been marginalized and excluded, including autistic people.
This is a lot to absorb, but I can already see how these solutions could lead to a more just and compassionate world, a world where everyone actually has the opportunity to reach their full potential.
That's the vision. But of course, there are challenges. Implementing these solutions is going to require a fundamental shift in our values and a willingness to confront those power structures that keep the current system going.
So it's not just about changing policies, it's about changing our whole way of thinking.
It's about changing how we view work, how we value human life, and how we see our responsibilities to each other. It's about recognizing that true security and well-being come from cooperation and care, not competition and exploitation.
That's a powerful message, and one that I think a lot of people are ready to hear. We've seen how the current system is failing so many, and there's this growing desire for something different, for a way to create a world that actually works for everyone.
Yeah, and that hope is fueled by the courage and resilience of the people most affected by the system. It's their voices that are leading the charge for a more just and equitable future.
This has been such an incredible exploration so far. We've talked about the harsh realities of this reserve army of labor and how information is being controlled. But we've also started to imagine a brighter future, one built on cooperation, care, and recognizing everyone's inherent worth.
And it's important to emphasize that this is just the beginning of the conversation. There's so much more to uncover, to discuss, and to act on.
You're right, this is just the starting point. We'll be back with part 3 of this deep dive to wrap things up and leave you with some final thoughts. So we're back, continuing our deep dive into this whole concept of the reserve army of labor.
Yeah, we've been really digging into Dr. Jaime Hoerricks' work and how it exposes these forces that are impacting autistic folks,
Right, we've talked about how the system manipulates people, marginalizes them, even uses those initiatives that seem positive, like inclusion, to just further its own goals.
And we touched on that kind of chilling idea of the enclosure of information.
Yeah, how those in power try to control what we know and limit our ability to even challenge the way things are.
Yeah. It's heavy stuff, and I can imagine some of what we've discussed might feel, well, discouraging.
It's understandable to feel that way. I mean, confronting systems like this, it can be overwhelming.
But it's important to remember that there's still hope, even in the face of all this.
Exactly. Hoerricks doesn't just leave us with this bleak picture. They actually offer a vision for something better, a more just and equitable future.
A big part of that vision is rejecting that idea that our worth is tied to how productive we are.
Like we always have to be proving our value, earning our right to exist.
It's a shift away from scarcity and competition towards a mindset of abundance and cooperation.
Recognizing that we're all connected and that true security comes from caring for each other.
It might sound radical, but we've seen how this system is failing so many. The need for change is becoming more obvious every day.
So where do we go from here? What are some tangible steps we can take towards this future?
Well, we talked about worker-owned cooperatives. They're a powerful way to give people more control, to build businesses that meet their needs.
Right, instead of trying to force themselves into a system that wasn't made for them.
And for those who can't participate in traditional work, advocating for things like universal basic income can help ensure everyone has that basic level of security.
Creating a safety net so that everyone can live with dignity.
But it goes beyond just policy changes. It's about changing our mindset, our values.
Moving away from that individual achievement above all else mentality.
Yeah, recognizing that our success is tied to the well-being of everyone around us.
So what can our listener do right now to help make this shift happen?
Start by talking about these things, break the silence.
Share what you've learned, challenge those narratives we've been talking about, help people see the cracks in the system.
Support organizations and initiatives working towards that more just and equitable world.
And most importantly, don't stop questioning the way things are.
Don't accept things just because that's how they've always been.
We have the power to imagine something better and to actually make it happen, but it takes all of us being active in that process.
Change doesn't happen overnight,
It's a journey. There will be bumps along the way.
But if we work together, support each other, and don't give up on that vision of a better world, we can make a difference.
Well, we've reached the end of our deep dive into the reserve army of labor.
Hopefully this conversation has left you feeling informed, maybe a little empowered, and inspired to take action.
Remember, you're not alone in this.
There are so many people out there fighting for that better future, a future where everyone has the chance to thrive.
Keep asking questions, keep learning, and keep fighting for that world that works for everyone.
Until next time, keep diving deep.